Hello everyone, a pleasant good morning to one and all present here. On behalf of PG and Research Department of English, Arulmigu Palaniyandar Arts College for Women, Palani, Dindigul District, Tamil Nadu, I invite you all to the grand celebration of World Indigenous Peoples Day. This is the first time our department has taken an initiative to celebrate this day. So, to raise the awareness of the needs of the population groups, that is the indigenous peoples, and to conserve the rights of these indigenous peoples, we have planned to celebrate this World Indigenous Day in a grand manner. The International Day of the World Indigenous Peoples is celebrated on August 9 annually every year around the world. Who are indigenous peoples? Indigenous peoples are the natives who lives in a particular area, that is the tribal people who are the earliest known inhabitants of that area. Okay, how do we celebrate International World Indigenous Peoples Day? Usually, the occasion starts off with traditional dances from natives around the world, then followed by singing, storytelling and many more. A small conference will be held to improve and give information about the indigenous peoples. So for that purpose only, our department has taken an initiative to celebrate this International Day of the World Indigenous Peoples Day 2020. Why do people celebrate the International Day of the Indigenous Peoples? This day is being celebrated to improve and to support the tribal people and to improve them in their political participation and economic development. And next, how to support indigenous peoples. We can support indigenous peoples by encouraging them to come up well in some fields like education, sports, social participation, etc. The theme of the last year is Indigenous languages. That is, the theme of the 2019 event is Indigenous languages, and this year's theme is COVID-19 and Indigenous peoples' resilience. The International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples Day is focused on enriching the cultural efforts that indigenous people experience around the world. So, we have a resource person to give more information about this topic, indigeneity and literature. I am much privileged to invite the resource person of today's program, Dr. P. Jayapriya, Dean Arts, Associate Professor and Head, Department of English and Foreign Languages, Mother Teresa Women's University, Kodaikanal. Here, I would like to give a short introduction about the resource person. She is a coordinator, Tamil Nadu Commonwealth Mother Teresa Women's International Center from 2013 till date. She is a zonal coordinator, ORC and RRC from 2011 till date. She is a cultural coordinator from 2018 till date. She is a coordinator, Curriculum Development Cell from 2018 till date. She has invited as a resource person for a 3-day workshop on creative writing and communication skills at Rashmi Institute, Colombo, Sri Lanka. She was invited as a resource person in Putra University, Malaysia. She was invited as a resource person for a plenary session in the international conference held at Hust University, Wuhan, China. It's a great pleasure to welcome such a noted personality as our guest of honor today. So, once again, on behalf of PG and Research Department of English, Arulmigu Palaniyandar Arts College for Women, I welcome the resource person of today's program. Hereby, I would like to utilize this platform to thank everyone who stood beside me. Foremost, I would like to thank our Madam Principal for having given her permission to do this program. Next, I thank our head of the department, Madam Mrs. P. Selvi, for motivating me. And I extend my sincere prayers to Lord Muruga to shower his blessings on us and make this program a successful one. Thank you.
Humble pranams at the lotus feet of the Lord of Palni Hills, who has bestowed me with an opportunity on this wonderful day to address you all, respected principal of APA College for Women Palni, beloved convener, Professor Selvi, head of the Department of English, dear organizing secretary, Mrs. Nagapushpam, faculty from the Department of English, who has taken much pain to organize this webinar, and dear faculty members from the Department of English, loving students and participants. A very happy and healthy morning to all of you. I'm indeed very happy to be with you on this day, virtually connected, to speak to you on Indigenous literature, specifically on the tribes of India and the literature related to it. Hello everyone, I'm very happy to address you on this World Indigenous Day, and I'm here to talk to you on Indigenous literature, culture, and specifically on the tribes in India. So Indigenous denotes, native, aboriginal, homegrown, primitive, tribal, ethnic, etc. So it means originating and living or occurring naturally in an area or environment. It describes something or someone who is native to an area or who naturally belongs there. So how to define indigenous? We have G.N. Devi, a renowned scholar on indigenous studies, in his book on indigeneity, culture and representation. He writes that recognized as Aborigines in Australia, as Maori in New Zealand, First Nations in Canada, and Indigenous in the United States, and you have Janajatis in India, or as tribes in anthropology, as notified communities in the administrative parlance of many countries, as indigenous people in the discourse of human rights, and as Adivasis in the terminology of Asian activists. So these variously described communities are far too numerous and dispersed in geographical locations to admit of any kind of single inclusive description. So the word aborigine or tribal brings to our mind a picture of half-naked men and women with arrows and spears in their hands, feathers in their heads, and speaking an unintelligible language. Their lives often combined with myths of savagery and cannibalism. So even when majority of the communities in the world kept changing their lifestyles, competed with each other and developed materialistic instincts to keep pace with the progress of the world, there were communities still living in line with their traditional values and customs and beliefs too. So the exploitative mindset of the mainstream society made these communities recede often into forests and high altitude mountains, where they could continue to live in peace with nature and their unpolluted surroundings. As the so-called civilized communities of the mainstream society neither could comprehend the values and ideals of these communities, nor had the patience to understand their lifestyles. So the mainstream world branded them variously as natives, uncivilized people, aboriginals, Adivasis, tribals, indigenous people, etc. So in Australia, we mostly refer them as aborigines. And in India, we mention them as tribals or Adivasis or Girijans, we call them. So in spite of the merciless treatment by the civilized men and the socio-economic perils faced by these communities all over the world, the aborigines or tribes continue to live in the continents of Africa, Asia, North and South America and Australia. So to talk about their culture and other stuff, there is one word in English, which is called as korobor. This word is generally used in English for all Aboriginal ceremonies, rituals, and entertainment involving singing and dancing, disregarding great differences between sacred and non-sacred dancing and dramatic performances. So, the basis of many ceremonies, according to them, is a dream. A man, occasionally a woman, claiming to have had a set of songs and dance steps shown to him in a dream. So, the ceremonies included statements about how other people lived or what people did in other places, as well as about the other happenings. So based on the content of the ceremonies, we can divide them into three major groups. The first one is ceremonies which involve the reenactment of myths or stories. So these are presented in a stylized form and all actions are symbolically significant. So the dance, the song and the ceremony as a whole are independent. So number two, the dance movements, individually or collectively performed in relation to specific songs, but not having mythical substantiation. These may be regarded as traditional, but as having, no specific meaning other than that. So it is the dance and the rhythm which count and not the explanation of it. So the third one is imaginative and inventive dancing and songs composed to translate for public enjoyment, if not information, contemporary events of everyday living. So the third one is imaginative and inventive dancing and songs composed to translate for public enjoyment, if not information, contemporary events of everyday living. Many of the dramatic performances with songs and musical accompaniment are of this sort, and they are not necessarily a result of alien impact. Only a small percentage concerns themselves with contact situations. The majority relate directly to the ongoing life of the camp here. So, apart from the songs and poetic expression, dancing and dramatic performances and other oral literature, they have visual art which includes cave and rock paintings, rock engravings and petroglyphs, paintings on bark and crayon, body painting, sacred objects and emblems, carved human figures in wood, wax and clay figures, pole structures, etc. So, body painting is an important aspect of rituals. Almost every part of the body is used for this purpose. Most commonly, the face, chest, and thighs are decorated with designs spreading across and over the shoulders to the back, leaving the neck bare. So each detail of the pattern is linked to ancestral beings, recent events, and hence Aborigine body painting is map making and myth telling. While decorating themselves, they sing the relevant songs and retell the myth. So many early groups of human beings of different races, speaking different languages and having distinct cultures, who have inhabited various parts of the world from the Paleolithic period onwards, now come under the label of tribe. So the term tribe, which is derived from the Latin tribua, originally meant a political unit and was later used to refer to social groups defined by the territory they occupied. Although there is no consensus on the definition of a tribe in anthropology, tribes are generally considered to be social groups. They are bound together by kin and duty and associated with a particular territory. So members of a tribe share the social cohesion associated with a family, together with the sense of political autonomy of a nation. So the current use of the term has evolved from the stages in the anthropological and sociological studies of the evolution of the social and political aspects of human societies. Today, the word tribe stands for numerous and varied communities scattered all over the globe, variously called Aboriginal people or as Indigenous people in the discourse of the United Nations and human rights. In India, the word tribe is used to denote the original inhabitants or the indigenous people, or in other words as Adivasis. So the Native American tribes like the Sioux, Apache, Cherokee, or Navajo, the Inuit and Métis of Canada, the Yupik or the Eskimos of Alaska, the Maoris of New Zealand, the Koori, Murri or Palawa of Australia, the Mundas, Santals, Nagas, Khasis, Bills, Orans, Shabars, Kadars or Irulas of India, the Ainu of Japan, the groups of Bushmen and Pygmies of Africa, they are all described as tribes today. So it is now an umbrella term that includes diverse group of people who are believed to be the original inhabitants of whichever place they occupy and whose distinct historical, ethnic, cultural and linguistic attributes have survived into the present. However, it can be unequivocally stated that one feature shared by almost all tribal groups all over the world is that of a checkered history of conflict with other human societies, and the undeniable fact that their livelihood, language, culture, and environment are now facing a serious threat of extinction under the overwhelming forces of political, economic, and cultural globalization. So, as every student of Indian history and culture will agree, India has been a vibrant and viable mix of races, languages, religions, and cultures since prehistoric times. So the term Adivasi or original inhabitant or indigenous people is usually used to describe today's tribes, though it is now agreed that many of today's tribes appeared in India at different historical periods. So maybe hunter-gatherer and shifting cultivator, societies which had flourished in India from the late Pleistocene onwards to be later displaced by more advanced agricultural pastoral societies from around 10,000 BC. As more complex societies developed in later periods, it is believed that many of the tribes were incorporated into mainstream society, mostly into the lower castes as peasants and craftsmen. But those tribes that continued to occupy their traditional forest and agricultural lands retained their independence and autonomy, remaining outside the pale of caste society, we can say. So while the superiority of the later technologies in agriculture and trade ensured the growth of powerful urban centers, cities and kingdoms, it led to the effective marginalization of many earlier tribal communities who led isolated existences on the fringes of these societies. So unlike in other countries, the isolation was relative in India, since many large tribes like the Bills and Gonds, they later established kingdoms or were incorporated into regional political systems. So there was also an ongoing process of appropriation and assimilation in many aspects between Hindu and tribal communities. in material and cultural matters during the medieval period. But most marginal tribal groups were generally considered to be different, uncivilized, backward, savage, and ritually unclean. So, this process of marginalization was accelerated during the British colonial period in Indian history. So, the political and economic interests of the British saw the large scale exploitation of forests and land for resources like timber and mineral, and the tribals were robbed of their traditional habitats and means of livelihood. So, with the imposition of new administrative and legal measures by the British, the tribals lost their traditional lands and were forced to work as agricultural laborers under the exploitative zamindar system. So, the British also introduced the bonded labor system, which compounded the exploitation, creating a new class of native exploiters in zamindars, middlemen, moneylenders, and contractors. So, along with economic deprivation and landlessness, tribals have had to witness the slow but sure death of their distinctive cultural identity. Tribal cultures are predominantly oral, and though there are more than 90 tribal languages in India, the majority of them do not have scripts. Although orality has been very much a part of India's cultural traditions, the dominance of the written tradition and the introduction of printing in the 19th century effectively sealed the fate of many of the tribal languages and cultures. Unable to write themselves into the history of the nation, they have been mute witnesses to their contribution to India's rich and varied heritage going unrecognized and unrewarded. So every Indian will agree that it is high time that the inheritors of this ancient land were given their due. So it is with this intention that one approaches the field of tribal studies here. So anthropology, which literally means the study of human species, was born as an academic discipline in the 19th and early 20th centuries at the height of the imperialist project, and was developed in order to study the different races and cultures of the world. Today's use of the term tribe as an ethnically, linguistically, culturally autonomous and self-conscious unit was originally a colonial concept. So the present association of the term with primitivism is largely a creation of colonial practices that sought to impose a different social and political order on communities that were largely autonomous in nature. So the political and economic agenda of the imperial project was supported and supplemented by the practice of colonial discourse that sought to construct an imperialized other in the colonized people. Through scientific and sociological discourses of race. So discourse is a widely used term in disciplines like linguistics, social sciences, cultural and literary studies today. And the study of discourse tries to understand the myriad processes by which human beings engage with language in order to represent their experiences of life. According to its application in various disciplines, three main approaches to discourse studies are generally identified: the formal and linguistic approach, the empirical or sociological approach, and the critical approach. So in a strictly linguistic sense, discourse is the name given to units of language that are longer than a single sentence. That is, long stretches of utterances or dialogues that involve both a speaker and a listener in a particular social context. So in its original Latin form, discurrer means running to and fro, which probably led to its application in the field of communication with the connotation of give and take or dialogue. So based on its linguistic parameters, the term discourse, when used as a countable noun here, that means a relatively discrete subset of a whole language, which is used for specific social or institutional purposes, as in legal discourse or novelistic discourse or the discourse of nationalism. So, in common usage, discourse means a way of organizing thought into a text or treatise of some length, and the word discursive has the sense of textually or linguistically produced. Thus, discourses can be conversations, formal speeches, journalistic reports, academic texts, texts of the different genres of literature, forms of orature, and so on. So the empirical or sociological approach works on the assumption that discourse means human conversation and uses texts of actual conversations, leading to studies of social organizations and relationships. So the analytical method has been used effectively in disciplines like anthropology and feminist sociology to uncover the ways in which discourses are used to create subjectivities. For example, to define the woman or the tribal, and to construct and maintain hierarchies. It studies language use and language in use and is concerned with understanding human language in its social context. So the critical approach to discourse focuses on the historical, political, social forces that determine and control the production of discourses and explores the power relations involved in the structures of society. Based on the philosophical assumption that the world and its forms can be known only through language. So this critical notion of discourse found favor in various disciplines like philosophy, history, psychology, literature, and culture studies. So European discourse theorists like Michael Foucault, Michael de Certeau, Louis Althusser, Hayden White, and others have used the idea of discourse to critically engage with the ideologies that underlie different kinds of social institutions and knowledge disciplines. So this approach is used widely in critical schools like post-structuralism, new historicism, feminism, post-colonialism, and culture studies. So the French philosopher, historian, and critic Michael Foucault contended that discourses or discursive practices are systems of thought comprising statements, ideas, attitudes, beliefs, practices, and actions that construct the subjects and the worlds they speak of as they come into being. He argued that man is a historically constructed entity who is brought into being through discourses. So due to the operations of power and allied historical factors, certain discourses were dominant at certain times, while certain others were marginalized and even obliterated. And power knowledge is the term Foucault uses to indicate the unholy nexus between the production of knowledge and the exercise of power. Even Edward Said applied Foucault's formulation of the link between power and knowledge to an analysis of the structures of domination and marginalization related to colonialism. So inaugurating the academic field of post-colonial studies, sets Orientalism, it contended with the imperial West, which created the Orient through discourse in order to facilitate and legitimize the political and economic goals of imperialism. He argued that this discourse, based on a theory of racial and cultural difference, gave credence to ideas of racial superiority of the white races over the black, leading to Eurocentric hegemony in economic, political, and cultural practices, and effecting the marginalization and obliteration of the indigenous cultures and knowledge systems in the Middle East, in India, in Africa, and other colonized countries. So there has been a long history of writing about the tribals in India from very early times in history to present day. Aboriginal political activism and Aboriginal imaginative literature are closely connected. Kath Walker, in her opening speech to the second Indigenous Writers' Conference held in Melbourne in November 1983, set down the Black Commandments to be espoused by Aboriginal writers. Let me list out the Black Commandments to you. Number 1, thou shalt gather thy scattered people together. 2, thou shalt work for black liberation. 3, thou shalt resist assimilation with all thy might. 4, thou shalt not become a black liberal in a white. 5, thou shalt not uphold the white lies in a black society. 6, thou shalt take back the land stolen from thy forefathers. 7, thou shalt meet white violence with black violence. 8, thou shalt remove thyself from a sick white society. 9, thou shalt find peace and happiness in a stable black society. 10, thou shalt think black and act black. 11, thou shalt be black all the rest of thy days. Imagine the last one, thou shalt be black all the rest of thy days. So in his book on indigenous literature, a writer called Madruru, he points out a number of differences between indigenous and mainstream literature. First, he shows that within Australian settler literature, the many indigenous communities and cultures are given a singular totalistic representation as the other, the aborigine, with the European settler being the subject. While in all Aboriginal literature, instead of the subject, other dichotomy, there is simply subject-subject. Secondly, he claims that as opposed to the generalized historical narrative of mainstream literature, there are hundreds of localized histories in Aboriginal literature handed down by families, that these histories are concerned about family relationships, survival, and ritual, that they are the texts of community empowerment. Thirdly, the writer points out that instead of the domination of the written discourse of settler literature, this indigenous literature is an oral discourse. It uses different devices such as absence of closure, narrative dominance, epic style, collective authorship and recitation, generic fluidity, repetition, non-verbal and semi-verbal markers and other devices, many of which he claims are often edited out when it enters the print culture. Moreover, this literature is inclined to the interpersonal and how things are or where, whereas print culture texts tend to be about how things ought to be. So literary efforts by these indigenous people are characterized by an emphasis on aboriginality, you can say. An important characteristic of Aboriginal writing is its concern with history. So, Australian history had been written by the victor by taking the act of invasion of the so-called 1788 as the founding event, and by suppressing the existence of the Aborigines. The foundation myth pivoted around the sufferings and achievements of the pioneers and early settlers. So at the interface between the old and the new, and the power and knowledge of the Aborigines were held in respect, since there was survival value in accurate knowledge and representation. But later, parallel to the repressive government policies, the Aborigines were eliminated as acceptable speakers on any topic, and they appeared only on the margins of works in the mainstream of white literature, we can say. So Aboriginalism, based on the principle that since the other cannot represent themselves, they must therefore be represented by others, flourished. Silencing the Aborigines and negating their right to speak on their own behalf. So until the referendum in 1967, Aborigines were not classified as citizens of Australia and Australian literature, and that did not include Aboriginal texts. The genocidal phase, characterized by forced dispossession of Aborigines, brutal crushing of Aboriginal resistance, and containment through institutionalization. This was followed by the period of Aboriginal resurgence, which led to an Aboriginal cultural renaissance. So it is recognizably distinct from the orature of tribal Aboriginals collected and translated by the anthropologists, but draws on a wealth of traditional literature and incorporates a range of forms. So it has been noticed that Aboriginal people like this Kooris, Murris, Noongas, Yungars, Yappa, Yolu, Anangu, they all share common backgrounds in storytelling, and that there is a widespread and unique tradition of ironic humor about the situations in which they find themselves.